This is the Ozark Trail 10-person instant cabin tent, and I think it's really intended for a fairly specific target customer. And so I'm going to take you on a tour of this tent. We'll run through the main pros and cons, and then I'll tell you at the end of this video who I think this is really for. Let's get into it. Now, here's everything you get with the tent. First of all, you get this media center that you can hang like a tablet or an iPad in. There's also this big storage pouch thing that it comes with that you hang on the back wall, and also the polyethylene doormat that goes outside the tent. There's also the stakes here. There are 14 of these. They are medium in thickness. There is no point on the end. Overall, they're decent stakes, but nothing to write home about. And then you have here a little pamphlet with some warranty information, and then it also actually comes with a tent floor repair kit, which I haven't actually seen in many other budget tents like this, so that's kind of cool actually. And then you have the internal room divider that goes inside the tent, and then over here we have the stuff sack, of course, and it does have instructions sewn on to the inside of the stuff sack if that's something you like to use. And then over here we have the massive body and rainfly of the tent, and we'll see that in just a minute when it comes to the setup process. Okay, let's set this thing up. So the Ozark Trail tent is pretty large and bulky and kind of difficult to get unfolded, but once you get everything unfolded with this, then it is actually not that difficult to set up for the size of the tent. So what you do is you got to stand up the sides of the poles and get the joints pointing outwards. Once you do that, you can start putting on the little clips that go all the way around. They are pretty tight clips and it takes a little bit of doing to get them on there, but once you get it going, then you're good to go. Then you can start putting in the stakes. And once you get those stakes in, then the next step, of course, is going to be the rainfly of this tent. And the rainfly just kind of slides right over the top, as you can see here. And there are little Velcro straps, so make sure you do the Velcro straps in the corners to keep it nice and straight. And then you just pull down the shock cords, and there's little loops on the side of the tent that those attach to. And once you do that, then you can go ahead and do the guy lines of the tent. And then once you get the guy lines staked down, then that's really all there is to it. Now let's talk pros and cons. Let's start with the number one pro of this tent, and the reason why a lot of people might actually be interested in buying this tent, and that would be the just total size and space in here. This is a truly massive tent. The square footage on the floor is about 134 square feet according to my measurements, and that is a bit lower than the manufacturer. The manufacturer rates it to 140 square feet, but according to my measurements, it's 134, so we'll go with that. And it has a really good stand height. I'm standing up full height here. I'm 5'10", and the stand height in here is 78 inches, and so that is quite tall. And not only that, you get that peak height all the way across the middle of the tent here on this line, but also the vertical walls. The walls in this tent are quite vertical, and that creates a lot of internal space on the inside. So you can really walk around inside of this tent very comfortably, and a lot more so than a lot of other tents in this price range that just slope in a lot more or just simply aren't as big. The second pro I wanted to talk about is the ventilation in this tent. It is quite a large tent, and the relative mesh coverage is pretty low when you compare it to the overall size of the canopy in this tent or the body of this tent. However, what is really nice when it comes to ventilation is the number of mesh windows that you can open up in order to allow airflow from literally every wall inside of here. You can actually get airflow from each and every one of the sides in this tent, which does help a lot. Some tents you only get one direction, which of course does limit the amount of airflow that can pass all the way through the tent. That's not the case here. So we get 8 total windows that you can unzip. There's 1 on each small side, 2 on the back wall here, and then counting the doors, there's 4 on the front wall. So that allows you to open up a lot of ventilation, and importantly, you can open all of those windows without even taking the rainfly off, which is not the case for some other tents where you can't really maximize the total ventilation space without removing the rainfly. Being able to do that in this tent is a nice feature. And then if you look at the ground on the short side, there are also little vented like air access points on the bottom. There's 2 of those, so if you add those to the 8 window total, that's 10 little access points for mesh paneling. And then there's also this roof, of course, which is mostly covered in mesh. So there's a lot of opportunity to create airflow in here, and I would say that this is a pretty good summer tent because you can get so much ventilation with all of these various features put together. Next up, I want to talk about something that's kind of a pro and kind of a con, depending on your perspective and the way you think about this. But this tent has some really unique and kind of interesting features. First of all is this little pocket pouch thing that hangs on the back wall. This does detach. It's not fixed on there. And this is interesting because it does give you a pretty good storage option. However, you get this partially in lieu of regular storage pockets on the bottom of the tent. And so you don't really have the normal storage pockets that would be accessible when you're lying down in this tent that you would get in like a typical dome style tent. this is pretty much the main storage option, which maybe some people will like, but I think a lot of people will kind of miss those storage pockets along the bottom of the tent because you just don't get those here. Another thing that comes with the features is there's a little like media pouch that's kind of like this one. It hangs on the wall, and you can put like an iPad in there if you want to watch a movie, I guess, while you're camping, which maybe is appealing to some people, but you know, others might think it's kind of a gimmick. I feel like it's a little bit of a gimmick, but that aside, there's also another thing here, and that is a room divider. And I think a room divider actually is kind of a nice feature because it can be nice to have different rooms for different purposes. Maybe you have one to like hang out and play cards in, and another one where you actually do your sleeping, or maybe you just have two rooms for two different groups of people. There's a variety of things that you can do with this, and it is nice, I think, when tents include this that are large enough to accommodate that sort of a feature. And then the final thing I'll throw in is that there is a doormat. Some tents throw this in, and so it's kind of it's a less unique feature, but you do get that doormat as well. And so overall, this tent has some odd, interesting, unique features that are worth knowing about, and that's pretty much the full list. Let's talk cons. The first con is very significant, and that would be the wind resistance of this tent. If you just simply look at the geometry of this tent, you could tell that it has very large, flat sides that are quite vertical, and as a result of just simply this geometry, it's going to be catching a lot of wind, and I don't have a lot of confidence that it can stand up in high winds. And so if you're somebody who likes to go camping in a variety of environments, and you like to go some places that do have really windy weather, then you should think twice about getting this tent, because I wouldn't have a lot of confidence that it would stay put and not blow away, or at least blow over. This hasn't happened in any of my testing, to be clear, but just simply because of the shape and the design of this tent, I wouldn't at all be surprised to see that happen. Con number 2 is the waterproofing of this tent. Again, this is a really important one, and if you just look at how this tent is put together, you'll notice first of all that the rainfly is not a full coverage rainfly, and so some of the walls, of course, are going to be exposed to rain, and that's not necessarily a problem if you are waterproofed well on the walls, but again, there we have weaknesses. And so if you look at the windows, the zippers on the windows of this tent actually are not seam taped. And so that could definitely be a weakness, because it doesn't take much for rain to get through that mesh, and if it gets through that mesh, then it could theoretically go through the zippers. I didn't have leaks during my testing, but I could easily imagine this happening in a heavier rain. I was only able to test this during light and moderate rain. I could imagine if there's really a downpour, I could see this tent leaking. And so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the floor of this tent. So if you look at the floor, it does not have a bathtub floor, which isn't necessarily a problem if you've done a good job of waterproofing the floor seam. However, this floor seam doesn't even seem to be seam taped at all. That also wouldn't necessarily be a problem if it was seam sealed. I can't tell just by looking at it if it is seam sealed, and I haven't seen anything online that indicates that it is. And in a budget tent that's in this price range, and for as large of a tent it is, I wouldn't at all be surprised if these seams aren't seam sealed. And so if you were in a situation where there was some like groundwater, or there was some puddling going on, then I wouldn't have a lot of confidence in the seams on the floor of this tent, and so that would be another weakness. And so overall, if you look at this tent and you look at the waterproofing, it didn't leak during my testing, as I said. I want to be clear about that. However, if you look at all of the weaknesses of this tent, it seems pretty clear that if you put this in a really heavy rain, that you could have some problems. And so that's something to keep in mind. And the third con I want to highlight is the build quality. If you look at this tent, it's a budget tent, and it looks and feels like a budget tent. Let's start with the materials, and then we're going to talk about some of like the craftsmanship things that you can really notice right away in this tent. So first of all, the materials, it has a polyethylene floor, which is very similar to what you get in a lot of Coleman tents. I would kind of call it the typical budget flooring. It's kind of crunchy and just kind of feels low quality. And so that's what you get. It's a polyethylene floor. And then if you look at the body of the tent, it is a 68D polyester material, which is fairly typical. There's nothing super unusual about that in the budget range. And then if you look at the craftsmanship of this tent, this is one thing that I want to highlight. You can definitely tell just by looking around that some of the stitching holes where these seams are sewn together, you can really see that there's like some large holes actually in some of the seam points, and also there's some places where it looks like these stitching holes are kind of already under tension or stretching or tearing away a little bit in places where it looks like it could rip. And so just because of the way that this is built, I would not expect this tent to last a super long time. If you're just an occasional camper and you just want something that is going to be good for like once or twice in the summer, then it could be fine for you. But if you go camping a lot, or if you put it through some sort of rigorous circumstances, then this is probably a tent that's not going to last a super long time before you have to replace it. Now, who should actually buy this tent? Well, I think the Ozark Trail is really intended for the quote-unquote fair weather camper. And there's nothing wrong with being a fair weather camper, but that basically just means that if you have this tent, then you're probably going to cancel your trip if you have thunderstorms, heavy rain, high winds, or something like that in the forecast. And this tent just simply won't stand up to those things, right? However, on the other hand, you may also tend to go camping in warmer weather and like to have extra space to maybe set up a card table to play games on the inside of your tent. And if you like those sorts of things, then you might actually really like this tent. However, if you're not sure that this is the tent for you, then I highly suggest that you go and watch this video right here, where I did a head-to-head test of 7 different tents, all comparing them. They're all in the budget price range, and there's several tents in there that I actually like better than this one. So go check that out, and I'll see you over there. Bye now.